Welcome to the Develop Yourself podcast, where we teach you everything you need to land your first job as a software developer by learning to develop yourself, your skills, your network, and more. I'm Brian, your host. Today we have special guest Kyle Simpson, world famous software engineer, teacher, author of the You Don't Know JS series of books, and general JavaScript expert. How are you doing today?
Great. Thanks very much. And I appreciate the kind words of intro.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like many of us, I've read your books. I think maybe a year ago, I was writing on LinkedIn and I wrote a post about like learning JavaScript before React and about this mock interview I'd been doing. And you reposted that. And then I was like, I just got these notifications on LinkedIn about I was like, what's going on? And I saw, oh, wait, Kyle Simpson reposted me. And it like that made my day, made my week.
Oh, very cool. I'm glad to hear it.
Yeah. I've been loving following you. And I'm sure a lot of people that listen to this know of you and are going to be very curious to hear your opinions on JavaScript, kind of what you're up to, and generally your opinions on like learning to code. So before we get into that, I want to know a little bit about you. How did you get into writing code and what got you so interested, particularly in JavaScript?
Yeah. So I'll date myself a bit, but the first time I wrote code, the first time I programmed was 1991. And I learned programming first. The first language I learned was QBasic, which was a Microsoft variant of BASIC. And I was this was pre-Windows, so this was like DOS days. And I, like most people, kind of was interested in trying to write games. The story of actually how I got interested in programming, my friend and I, we were hanging out at his house and we were playing video games one day. And we walked in, we took a break and we walked into the den, and his dad, who was a professional programmer by trade, was working on the home computer in the den doing some programming. And my friend and I were kind of curious about it. We didn't really know what that was all about. It looked like a bunch of just weird symbols on the screen. Still does, I guess.
Yeah.
Anyway, I remember we asked him, like, what is that? Or how does that work? Or what are you doing? And he goes, hold on just a moment. And he click and in my memory, 30 plus years on, in my memory, it took him only like 30 seconds. I don't really know exactly how long it was, but he clicked for 30 seconds. And he hit a button. He hit the enter key. And all of a sudden, the screen went blue with a gray box in the middle, and it had my name in blue letters inside of the gray box. It said Kyle. And from that instant, I was hooked. I was like,
Wow.
Fascinated. Well, from nothing, you just made the computer do that. You made it print my name. You literally put me into it, if we want to get real poetic about it. And, got interested, like most people, like, oh, well, how do I make games? So QBasic, I started making little games and silly things like that. A few years later, I was actually able to, I had switched to writing Turbo Pascal, was the language that I was using. And I actually got paid to write a program. It was a point of sale software for a bike shop that was one of my dad's clients. And so they paid me to write them, inventory management and point of sale system. And so I kind of kept going from there, still as a teenager, but kind of picking up little projects and hobbyist, but getting paid some kind of hobby money for it. Went to school to study computer science. And by the time I was, end of freshman year, the web was starting to take off. This is like 98, 99. The web was starting to take more hold. Technology was starting to take more hold. And of course, I was turning my programming skills to that. And I built a couple of websites for some of my dad's clients and got paid to do that. And I also volunteered on a web-based student portal at my university. And that was the kind of the first big one of its kind anywhere in the country, totally student-built and student-led web portal. So I volunteered on that. So that's kind of how I bridged from the traditional programming into using programming skills for the web, was just kind of doing that. And ever since, just been really going at coding. But JavaScript, my first exposure to it was late 98 and early 1999. And back then, like most people, I didn't really necessarily think of it as a full programming language the same way I thought of Pascal or even QBasic. It just seemed like a little toy to kind of get a few things on a web page, but
Mhm.
it wouldn't take more than a couple of years to change my opinion on that, and I kind of dove in full bore into JavaScript.
Wow, that's a heck of a story, man. That's really interesting. Like, so what age were you when you like wrote that bike shop site or was working on that?
The first one I built, yeah, that wasn't even a site. That was a DOS app in Turbo
Okay.
Pascal. So I wrote that app twice, by the way. The first time I wrote it, I was 14. So that would have been 1994. Built that for them. I think it was 14, something like that. Anyway, around 1994, I think, is when I built the first one. Fast forward a few years, and Windows is now a bigger kind of a thing. The bike shop had moved to using Windows, and they didn't want to have to switch to DOS to use the app. So they commissioned me to remake it. And I, at that time, had started learning Visual C++. So I rewrote the app from scratch in Visual C++ for Windows. But yeah, that was so the first programming I did, I was age 11 in 1991.
Wow.
And then the first time I got paid for it was around age of 14 in 94.
Very cool. I got into it considerably later in life, around like 30.
Mm.
And I remember a webmaster showed me, I was working like in this school and I had to like update the site through some CMS and then something custom had to be made. And she showed me HTML and CSS. And I was like, wait, is this like how the web kind of works? And she's like, yeah. I'm like, how did I not like know this? And then like
Right.
I was like, I got to learn how this works. And then I just got hooked and just
Yeah.
could not stop goofing around.
I got exposed to the web in high school, like in 1995. I remember like 96 maybe. Like there was one computer in the whole school, and it was in the gifted and talented office, and you could like get a hall pass to go and spend 10 minutes and like surf. I think it was Netscape Navigator 2 or something crazy. And I just wish that even earlier back then I'd had a curiosity as to what was making the web do that. It
Mhm.
just wasn't in my sphere of thinking. Even though I was a programmer, for some reason the web
Interesting.
was not something that I was like inquisitive about until I got to college, several. But I feel like, oh, I missed out. I could have had a couple more year head
A
start
couple
on the
more
web
years
if
head
I.
start. I feel like you pretty up there. You also have a lot of interesting opinions on the web too, which I like to read online. It's which kind of brings me to it's some
Interesting
point.
is a
Yeah.
charitable term. We might say polarizing might be a little bit more
Well, that
honest.
makes it interesting. It'd be kind of boring. Like the web's pretty good, you know.
Yeah.
Which leads me to like what at some point you started writing online. I found you through your books, and I think a lot
Mm,
of other people are probably finding you through LinkedIn, through Twitter. What inspired you to do that and take your brand
mm,
online?
yeah. So in the early 2000s, I had learned more about JavaScript. I was kind of doing web development, and it was like full stack back then was the LAMP stack. It was PHP, database was MySQL. You used JavaScript a bit on the front end, basically the LAMP stack. And I was doing that in my first few professional programming jobs into the early 2000s. And what I found was that I really wanted to understand the JavaScript part of it more, and nobody was paying attention to that. Everybody was paying attention to the sort of backend stuff, like PHP or Perl or whatever it was that we were building back then. But I wanted to understand that JavaScript more, and there was not a lot of good material in 2002 or three for it. There were only like a couple of books, and they were like 6 inches thick, and it was tough reading, tough stuff. And so I made an early bet around 2003 or so, I would say, that JavaScript was going to become a bigger and bigger thing, and that there were going to need to be some people who really understood it, not just knew how to like get some stuff done, like really understood it at a deeper level. And so by 2003 and 4, I was really trying to become more of the JavaScript expert on the team. There were not job titles dedicated to JavaScript back then, but I was trying to become that. I think I maybe got my first job that was like explicitly a JavaScript job by like maybe 2006 or 7, something like that. But anyway, this is to say that I had been working as a professional developer for close to 10 years. Late 2000s, maybe 2008 or 9, is when I really started getting interested in not only doing that code, but doing it for the open source community. And I wrote a couple of projects. And the first one that really kind of hit it big and got me into the conference speaking scene was Lab.js, which was a dynamic script loader that came out in 2009. Nobody uses script loaders anymore, but I keep predicting maybe someday we're going to circle back around to the wisdom of old. But Lab.js was my first kind of big hit, and I kind of, was early on getting into conference speaking and talking about that and a lot of other web issues. In 2012, so I've been doing the speaking thing for a few years at that point. In 2012, this guy named Mark reached out to me and he said, "Hey, I run this video training platform. Have you ever thought about training?" And I was like terrified. I was like, "No, man, I can talk for 30 minutes and keep people's attention, but I can't talk for like 8 hours and keep people's attention all day long or whatever." So he
Yeah.
spent several weeks coaxing me into, "You should come up and teach a workshop for," and his platform, which a lot more people know about now, called Front End Masters. And he was like, "Hey, this is kind of brand new. I've just gotten this off the ground, and I've seen your talks and I think you could do this." And so he spent a few weeks convincing me, and I went up and did it. And I'll never forget, this is 2012, but it's just like it was yesterday, right? It's very vivid memory. I was standing at the front, at the lectern, at the podium, and it was a little bit after the lunch break, and people were working on an exercise that I had assigned for the workshop. And the workshop was actually, I think, on web performance optimization. It wasn't even strictly a JavaScript workshop, but I had assigned an exercise and they were working on it. And I looked out in the crowd and I realized something clicked for me. I realized that this is what I was put here to do, not to be the expert that walks into a project and says, "Move, let me do it," but rather to be somebody whose passion is to understand something deeply enough that I can share that with other people and empower them to go and do it. So there's a room of 25 people who all paid money for some crazy reason to come and listen to what I had to say, but they were all going to go back and do their own thing and use it in different ways. And I wasn't even really going to be part of that process, except in that I could empower them. I could give them more power through the knowledge that I was transferring to them. And that changed my whole life. And I realized at that moment, that's what I want to spend the rest of my career doing, is in some way, shape, or form, making it so that other people can do better by what I've been able to figure out. And I decided that I would basically learn in public. Everything I learn, I would learn along the way and document in public. And so that came in the form of trainings. A couple of years later, it came in the form of deciding to write a little book series that I never dreamed could have had the impact that it's had. I remember pitching Simon, my one of my favorite people in the whole world. I hope he's listening to this. Simon was an editor at O'Reilly, and I knew him from another project that I'd been on. And I sat down with him here in Austin, where I live. We sat down together at a little local bar, and I pitched him this idea. I was like, "Look, I want to write a little 3-book series, and each book I want it to be like 30, 50 pages, just short little snippets on very specific JavaScript topics." And I pitched him this idea, and I never thought he'd go for it, but he got a gleam in his eye, and he's like, "Yeah, let's try it." And so he got O'Reilly to give me a shot. So what was planned to be 3 50-page books, and I told Simon, I hope I will consider this a success if we sell 2,000 copies across all 3 books. That's what I want. I did my back of the envelope math, and I was like, if I can get 2,000 people to buy or read a copy, then I'm going to call this a success. You fast forward to today, it was 6 books in the first edition, over 1,100 pages total. So it turns out there was a lot more to say about JavaScript than I thought. And the second edition is at least, partially complete. I've written several of the books in the second edition, but across all of my books, I've sold well in excess of 300,000 copies.
Wow.
And I never could have dreamed. Like I said, I was planning for a lot smaller impact, but that was more of the same. I got told I don't know JavaScript on a job interview, and I was like, well, I'm going to fix that. I'm going to learn JavaScript, and I'm going to write about what I learned. And that's where the books came from. So my whole career since then has been, let me go and learn something. I gravitate to things that people overlook or take for granted. They use, but they don't understand why they're doing what they're doing. Those are the things that are kind of like the bat signal that says, hey, that's what you should focus on. And I dig into and I figure those things out, and I try to make something useful out of it, whether it's a library, whether it's a book, whether it's a conference talk, a training workshop, a podcast episode, anything that I can do to try to empower other people to understand stuff better. That's been my mission ever since.
Wow. That is an amazing story. I'm surprised I didn't know some of this before. I mean, so this is partly that you like had you knew that there's an opportunity here for me to become an expert in a field where there's not anybody. And then you also just discovered like, hey, here's this thing that I didn't know I was really passionate about doing as well.
Yeah.
That
And
is
and
cool.
and I'm blessed that people say that I'm a good communicator. I don't know that I was born that way, but I certainly do think that I'm a pretty good talker. I've never been accused of not having enough to say. Certainly the opposite. But whatever mix of innate talent plus just a lot of like you said, passion, just love of doing this. I figured out what I'm pretty good at, I think.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, I know that you paint yourself as a human centric technologist, which falls in line to your kind of outlook. And I can just tell you from experience, I remember I actually got told on a job. It was like 3 years into my career, and I got told on this team of really great developers that I considered really good. Said, "You don't seem to know JavaScript very well." And it was
Mm,
true. I'd been using it for years and thought I was actually like, "Hey, I'm pretty good. I make stuff happen, right?" And
right.
then that was when I took your books much more seriously. I went, I'm like, okay, I'm going to learn this stuff: scope, closure,
Mm,
asynchronous. I even read functional light, and
mm.
then it illuminated. I'm like, oh, okay, now I get what's going on a little bit underneath the hood. Some things were still not quite clear, but it gave me a lot more confidence as a developer. And I just attribute that to like an unlock. Like that was like the period where I felt like, okay, now I kind of get how to learn things. I can't just learn how to just use stuff. I need to learn a little bit about why it's working the way it does. It can't just be magic.
That was the mission of it. I'm always thankful when someone like you tells me that that mission resonated in some way. The mission was always keep doing what you're doing, but understand why what you're doing works at a deeper level, right? I'm
Yeah.
not trying to convince everybody use this tool or don't use that tool. I'm only trying to convince people that the better path is when you understand your tools. And I chose JavaScript, but whatever tool you choose, I want you to be curious. I want you to be inquisitive. I want you to demand more of it. And most importantly, I think that every single person deserves to be told those things. There was a culture in JavaScript around the turn of the decade, around 2009, 10. JavaScript, the good parts from Crockford,
That's right.
it really changed the industry and in a lot of ways for the good. I mean, he deserves a lot of credit. But there was a culture that grew around that because of that. It's funny how book titles can really carry more weight than the content themselves, because the book title itself created an impression that hangs on today, which is that JavaScript is a flawed language and it needs somebody to go through and figure out only the good stuff to pay attention to and then tell you what to ignore. And when I came along a few years later, what I was fighting against was the belief that you shouldn't really waste your time learning most of JavaScript. Most of it's bad, it's poorly designed, it's buggy, whatever. And you should really only, read this small little subset and learn this small little subset. And we see that same spirit play out today in almost every new thing. It's virally infected everything we've done in the front end industry. And I wrote the books to be, and I said it in the foreword, the anti the good parts, which is not to say the bad parts, is to say all the parts. I think that we should demand and expect that we have the right to understand and we can understand all of those things. That doesn't mean I use every single feature in JavaScript. There's plenty that I don't
Yeah, right.
use, but I shouldn't not learn it simply because somebody said there's no good use for it. There are most, not all, but most every feature in JavaScript has some place that it's useful. And I think we should learn those things.
Yeah, I completely agree. That's so funny that you say that. Of course, you've seen all the memes. JavaScript, the good parts, small book. JavaScript, the bad
Right.
parts, dictionary-sized book.
I don't know if you ever saw the image that I put out, but when I published the first edition, I put together an image and put it out on the book series' social media. But I recreated that image with JavaScript the definitive guide and then JavaScript the good parts, and I stacked my book series on top of JavaScript the good parts, and I said, "There, I fixed it for you."
I think I know I've seen this. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah,
meme.
that's quite a sustainable meme.
We got to bring that back. So this kind of leads me also to, so you spent a significant portion of your career teaching others, and really maximizing like your impact on the JavaScript and developer community at large. How do you think new developers should be learning JavaScript and maybe generally web development?
Right. Well, so I can actually use a little bit of a anecdotal answer to that. And I asked permission, or sort of told my wife that I was going to share this. My wife and I were recently having a conversation. She's a fantastic person, very smart. She doesn't work because she's been home with our kids the whole time. Our kids are almost 13, 10 and almost 13. So she's been home with the kids now for almost 15 years now. And she had a career before, but doesn't. She runs our home, and she runs it a lot better than I do, so I'm giving her props for that. But we were having this conversation recently where she kind of brought up, like, I wonder if I should get a job, or if I should go back to the workforce, or find a new career, or something like that. And I kind of, like, half seriously and half jokingly said, well, you ought to learn to be a programmer, and I think I could teach you. And I actually said it also to my son, and to my surprise, she took me up on it. So actually, we've done 2 or 3 short little sessions where I've just started to, like, teach her, like, what is HTML? What is JavaScript? How does a variable work? What's an if statement? I'm just starting at the very basics. And I use that anecdote to say, number one, anybody and everybody that has a curiosity to understand how we communicate with each other and with the computer, how to solve problems. If you have a curiosity for how to do that, then you should be a developer. That's it. That's the only prereq, is that desire to understand, to inquire about the way that we communicate that information. First, we communicate with other people, because we rarely are writing alone on an island.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We're almost always collaborating in some way with someone else. So first we have to think about communication with others. And by the way, even if you were communicating, even if you were solo deving, right? Never going to have anybody else ever look at your code. You are communicating with your future self. So you are always communicating with a human when you write code, first and foremost. And I would encourage anyone out there that if you think of things that way, and if that intrigues you, if that interests you, you should become a developer. There are 1,000,001 flavors of what becoming a developer means. There's the hobbyist and the professional tracks, and every variation in between. But I just encourage anybody that's listening, if you've had that, or you know somebody that's had that kind of latent curiosity about, how do I make the system do what I want? How do I communicate some new way of solving a problem or doing a task? Software development's for you. And I call it a superpower, because when I run up against something that doesn't do what I want it to do, that's not a blocker to me. I can make the computer do what I want it to do, and I can communicate that with other people if I need help. And that's a superpower that this industry's given me. So my wife is curious about it, and I told her, it probably won't take more than a week or two before you'll know, is this for me or not?
Yeah,
So
right.
I'll teach you. I'm quite confident that I can teach you, but it'll be up to you to decide, is this does this make you curious? Does it make you excited when you don't know how to do something and then you figure out how to communicate it? That's how you come. So number one, find if that's for you. And it doesn't take more than a couple of weeks of exploration to find if this is for you. It's not for everyone, but it's for a
Mm-hmm.
lot of people. And that's, in my opinion, the only spark that you really need is that part.
I
Number
like that.
two,
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Sorry, go ahead.
I would say that building for the web, and specifically being a JavaScript developer in the web. I mean, there's lots of different disciplines. You might be somebody who's more inclined to design, but since we're talking to people who are developers probably listening, say you want to leverage your coding skills that you develop into using JavaScript on the web. There is absolutely a way to learn these technologies, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, while you learn what I will call the layer on top, because I think it deserves recognition as its own layer of abstraction, what we call front end frameworks these days. They are effectively a new generation of languages. They're not just little tools that happen to run in JavaScript. I think they are deserving of a whole own distinction in terms of generational abstraction, right? If we had the first generation of programming languages was the assembly language, and the second generate, I think the frameworks and the tooling that we've built on top of that is its own new generation, and I think that's okay. So you are probably, if you want to build things quickly, and especially if you want to develop skills that you can get a paycheck for someday soon, that's the layer to target, right? Because there are very few people that are paying for just the JavaScript layer anymore. What they're paying for is this higher level generation. And quite frankly, I don't know much about that layer. I've dabbled in it. I've tried to learn a little bit of React over the last few months. I don't know much about that layer, and I'm not really employable in that layer. But there are tens of thousands or millions of people that are. And I encourage that. I'm not against that. But you can learn at that layer. You can pick up things along the way about how JavaScript and HTML and CSS work while you're learning at that layer. But you should go into this eyes wide open, knowing that one of the main design philosophies of that layer is not to have you really pay much attention to the stuff at the layer below. They're trying to abstract those things away. And if they were creating abstractions in the truest sense of that term, abstraction was not about hiding details, it was about separating details. If the people who were designing that generation of the frameworks and tooling that is modern web development these days, if that's what they were focused on, is like, how do I make a really good abstraction, then what you would be building would be something that helped you understand that problem space better, and also helped you be able to switch gears and focus on the underlying technology. That both would be true. And right now, modern tooling's only doing the former, not doing the latter at all. They are really trying to get you to never write much markup. They want you to write this abstracted form called JSX or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want you to write real CSS. They want you to write some abstraction on it of, there's 10 million flavors of it. And even JavaScript. Now, they don't want you to write JavaScript. They want you to write something that compiles to JavaScript. So they're really trying to get you to not use those core technologies. Along the way, you will pick up some of it, but you will not pick up all of it. You just won't. And I made this claim the other day, and some people agree, some people disagree. But I if I had to put a number on it, I'd say, at best, you might learn about 60 or 70% of the underlying technology if you spent a lot of time and really devoted effort at that higher level to also understanding the stuff. You might get about 60 to 70%. And for many people, that's plenty enough, right? So the people that are listening, if that's your goal, you want to be really, really good at that modern web layer, and you want to have just a sort of basic competency at the layer below, which would be the core web technologies, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, I think that's perfectly fine. And plenty of people are making a great career at it. I endorse it. Whatever layer you choose to focus on, I have always said this consistently. You could probably find clips going back to the mid 2000s of me saying something to the effect of, it is always best if you seek to master the layer of abstraction that is your primary focus, and you seek to also have a solid competency at the layer below. So if you were a C programmer back in the day, being a really good C programmer was mastering the C programming language, but having a pretty good understanding of what was going on at the assembly level below. And maybe if you could even say the same about being a good assembly language programmer way back, you probably had to really understand what was going on at the instruction level, the zeros and ones level. JavaScript, if you want to be a really good JavaScript developer, and that's your layer of abstraction, which is what I chose. And I'll broaden that to all of the web technologies, but especially JavaScript. If that's what you want to do, you should master that, and you should be pretty competent at the layer below, which we would call that sort of C or systems level programming. Maybe it's Rust these days, but you should be competent at that layer. So most people in our industry are not going to get paid to do that. Most people are going to be one level up. And so they should be seeking to master those things. And they should also be seeking to have a solid competency at the layer below, which is the core web. And the only issue that I have with our industry right now with respect to that, I've got lots of other issues, but with respect to this particular topic, the major issue I have is that very few of those technologies are designed to make that reasonable. It's much more difficult than it ought to be for you to master React and also have a really solid understanding of the core stuff below. And React is even pretty, it's lower level, right? Some of the newer ones, and I'm not saying anything bad about them, but the newer ones, the views and the quicks and other, they're putting even more magic on top and separating you even further from the core web tech. That makes it a lot harder, and there's a lot of reasons why people just never do. And so I encourage people not only learn JavaScript, HTML, and CSS, or only learn those frameworks and tools. I encourage you to do both, and I think you can do both at the same time.
Wow, that is interesting because I did not actually expect that from you, to be honest. I thought you were going to go the other route and say you should get fully master JavaScript before you get into a framework like React or something. And I've seen a lot of people, and I've talked to a lot of people that have that belief. And I kind of take your stance, like, yeah, you're going to ultimately be paid to create apps based on some framework, React Native, React, Next.js, whatever. But I have gone into interviews or mock interviews with people that say, "Hey, I know React," and they can actually make a fully functioning React app, and then they fall apart at what I would consider basic JavaScript, which is always really interesting and maybe a little bit concerning.
My guess is that's probably what your coworker meant all those years back
Yes.
when they told you,
Yes.
like, you were pretty good at whatever the thing was, whether it was a tool or a framework, I don't
Hmm.
know, but you were probably pretty good at that. And then they were like, okay, well, how do we rearrange this closure or whatever? And that's where it falls apart, right? It's
Yes.
this is there's a the term that I use for this is happy path driven development. These systems are designed where they work really well when you stay on the happy path, when you stay on the blessed path, when you do the readme that they put out in the repo, when you code like their readme, it's going to be great. I mean, the people that build these things are impossibly brilliant geniuses that design these frameworks and these libraries and these tools, and I could only dream to create something as attractive and fun to work with as some of these tools are. But they really do only work when you stay on the green pasture path. And I have just spent most of my career not being able to be on that path for one of a variety of reasons. And those tools start to really get in your way unless you know what you're doing. If you don't know how to navigate off the path, you're in trouble.
Yeah, and that was the problem. I switched from like Angular JS to Ember JS, and then going into React, and I was like, wait a second, I'm compiling like framework knowledge here, which is not a bad thing either. But yeah, learning more under the hood really gave me that confidence and ability to switch around between things
Right.
and kind of get like, okay, here's how this is really working. I know you're on the job market right
Mm,
now, correct? Are you still on the job
I
market?
am. I am definitely still
Okay.
actively.
Okay. What is the ideal role for a Kyle Simpson?
Whew. Well, the ideal role for me is defining seniority the way I think it always should have been defined, which is that the more senior you are, the more others focused you should become. Most people, if you ask them what makes a senior developer, they're going to give you some answer that says number of years, number of mistakes, number of lessons learned, etc. And that's important, but not most important. Most important to me is that the more senior you are, the broader your angle of focus. You're broadened out to a wider and wider swath of your context of your environment, and you've incorporated all of the humans around you into your systems level thinking. I believe that the most senior people should be what I call myself human centric technologist. I think they should aspire to something like that, even if that's not their label, because I think you really should be asking first, whenever you encounter those kinds of problems, what's the human solution to this, before saying, what's the technology solution? Not that technology is not important. This is our bread and butter. I'm gonna be writing code to the day I die, right? I'm not at all suggesting the technology doesn't have a role to play, but I don't think that it should be the first thing we reach for. We should be reaching for the human things first, and then bringing technology along to augment in the ways that our human, inefficiencies fall apart. And I see far too often the reverse of that. And so when I'm looking at jobs, I'm seeing a lot of the former definition of seniority, which is just, hey, can you write more code than this guy? We'll pay you more, but we need you to write 10 times as much code as this guy. And I don't want to do that. I want to write code, but I want to write less code and be more others focused. I would rather look for a role that wanted to recognize that my real value is not in the 10 lines of code I'll write today, but in the 10 lines of code that I'll help 100 other people write. That's where my real value, I think, is. And those roles are hard to find, so I'm having to be pretty picky about it. But to be specific, I'm looking for principal level and above individual contributor roles
Mm-hmm.
focused around JavaScript in the web, because that's a tool and skill set that I can really bring to bear when I need to bring to bear that technology. But it needs to be balanced between the technical contribution and the people contribution, mentoring, developer advocacy, education, best practices, engineering culture, all the other things besides the lines of code, which I would argue are probably more in aggregate more important than the lines of code themselves.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of I couldn't really imagine like working next to you on a team as like you writing a lot of
I don't think
JavaScript.
you want me putting buttons on a page. That I probably wouldn't be very good at it. I'm a slow coder, and I think that annoys people. But like, I'm really deliberate. I'll spend all week long to figure out the 3 lines of code I should have written. I won't. I'm so yeah. You don't want me on the team if you're trying to get a button on there quickly. That's not me.
Chief peer review
There you go. Yeah, I
officer.
can do a lot of. I can do code review. That's for sure.
I could only imagine, man. Yeah. Do you think your online persona has like hurt or helped you in this search at all? I would imagine there's a lot of people that want a Kyle Simpson on their team and maybe people that don't.
I I don't think that's true. I think the vast majority of companies don't want a me, and they only think they would want a me. And that's why I'm still on the job market. This is I was unemployed for 5 months last summer, so a year and a half ago, and it was tough to find work back then. It's 10 times as hard to find work now. I hope it didn't take me 10 times as long, but it's a lot harder now. And I would say that the majority of companies are not organized in such a way where they're building out the internal maturity of their engineering teams in the way that I'm describing, where they're intentionally trying to make each level of seniority, it doesn't matter what the job title is, but it
Hmm.
matters that you are creating these levels of maturity within your organization. And at each level, you should be looking to, when you promote somebody or hire somebody into each successively higher level, it should be about their ability to impact more and more of your organization. This sort of inverted pyramid kind of model.
Hmm.
Most companies are not really building that. They're really just, they're desperate to get more code churned out. They're desperate to, I mean, today they're desperate to rewrite everything using an AI somehow. So they're really just looking for, if I could hire a more senior person and maybe pay them, I can hire somebody with twice as much skill, but only pay them 10% more. And can I get them to churn out 3 times as much code as the next guy down the ladder? That's what most companies want or need or think they want or need right now. And I don't fit at all in that scenario. So the vast majority of companies probably don't have a spot for me. But I do think there are organizations that are recognizing that what we do is more about the people that are doing it than it is about the computer that's executing these bits. And when organizations get to the point where they recognize that, I think there's plenty of companies that can benefit from having, I call principal level development as its
Hmm.
own discipline. It's, it's not the architect. And I think there's a lot of conflation there. It's not a manager, because my goal is not to say yes or no to people or to tell people what to do. It's not the architect who's like, sitting up in the clouds thinking about all the big picture, but, just saying, making decisions and letting other people implement. It's not that either. It's a third discipline within an engineering org to become internal cheerleaders and advocates for best practices. That's what I see the principal discipline being for organizations that really get this. And so, if I see 100 job postings for a principal software engineer, 1 out of 100 of those is at an organization that actually gets that. The other 99 are using that word principal because they're hoping they can get a 10x coder.
Okay, yeah. See, so you have a fairly like you have some constraints on what you're looking for in general, and it's fairly unique. And you're right that
I,
not a
I,
lot of organizations would support that or even know how to support that kind of role.
I'm being very picky because I don't want to waste their time or mine.
Yeah.
I I'm not going to be useful, and I would quite frankly require being way overpaid for the, can I churn out lines of code? And I just don't work like that. I don't like to do that sort of thing. So I'm being picky to say the most important thing is that I'm slotted into an organization that culturally understands the need for that. Either they're already doing it or they feel the need to do it and want to do it, and that's an organization I want to join. But that never shows up in a job description. That only shows up in your third or fourth conversation, if you even get that far.
Yeah, that's a tricky one too, because I can imagine how many times people say, "Oh yeah, we want you," and then you say, "I don't think you really do want what I
It's
got."
a lot more of that. Like, I'm not getting a lot of, I'm being honest, I'm not getting a lot of calls. I'm getting a lot of auto rejections, or I say auto rejection, meaning I'm just getting an email saying sorry, but no, without any conversation. Getting a lot of that, so I'm not getting a lot of conversations. But in the conversations I am having, it's a pretty narrow funnel. But in the conversations I am having, I actually am attempting to weed myself out as quickly as possible. I prefer to be really blunt and just say, this is what I bring, this is what my superpower is, this is where my value proposition is, and here's the following reasons why that may or may not really be your kind of work. And so I would much rather do that and not waste anybody's time, not get into a job and then 2 months in,
Mhm.
everybody on both sides is like, this was a mistake. I don't want that. They don't want it. I don't want it. So it's incumbent on me to be, to weather the storm, if you will, of pre-filtering myself out of a lot of this stuff rather than just, apply to 1,000 things and see what sticks. That's not my style.
That makes a lot of sense for you, and I appreciate it. I'm sure a lot of us do that. You're sharing your journey with us on like LinkedIn, Twitter. A couple days ago, I know you wrote something about your job search so far, and you're really candid about it. I think that's just cool you're doing that. And you also posted about an interview you failed a while ago, and it was for
Hmm.
JavaScript. And I
Yeah.
think a lot of us read it and said, geez, if the author of You Don't Know JavaScript fails an interview, what does that mean for all of us? And so I'm
Yeah.
curious, like, how do you deal with like rejection, self doubt as the
Right.
author and well known JavaScript expert?
Well, yeah, I mean, it still stings to fail a basic coding interview. I didn't fail in the sense that I couldn't do what was asked. And I stand by the code that I wrote, because for those that read that post, I went and replicated those questions in code pens and basically rewrote what I submitted, because I just wanted to document it. And this is the exact same pattern that I've been doing for well over a decade now, which is, if I'm going to learn something, I'm going to learn it in public so that other people can learn it too. This is a tough pill to swallow, that what I have to learn is how to get a job in a market that's changed since the last time I had to do this. It's changed a lot, and it's a lot of learning, and I don't have a lot of confidence that I'm up to the task. I have a lot of self-doubt in myself right now. And failing a basic JavaScript job interview doesn't help, right? It's a ding to my confidence, the same way it would be for anyone, no matter what level you're at. When somebody says, nope, you don't cut it. But I didn't fail that JavaScript job interview because I don't know JavaScript. I think I'm decent at JavaScript at this point. I actually failed it because I was way too slow and deliberate. I asked a lot of questions and I just didn't get enough of it done. And that that for whatever reason was, I'm assuming, I don't know, because they never gave me feedback, but I'm assuming that the main reason I failed is because I was like, I'd rather do one of these problems pretty well and fully understand the problem rather than churn out three shitty half solutions. And that's a part of what I'm learning now, is what it is to get a job in this current market is not what it was a year ago even. And it's not, in my opinion, for the better, but it is what it is. So I'm learning that and I'm documenting it. And I accept the reality that I am a flavor that is not going to be attractive to everyone, and to even maybe to the majority, right? There are a lot of people, and I want to just say that I'm so appreciative for the people who like me, that support me, who feel like they've gotten something positive from what I've tried to do. There's a lot of that out there. I call it the long tail of our industry, and I'm thankful for that. There's a lot of other people who are not fans of me, and I'm trying to be polite in how I describe that, but there's a lot of people who are not fans of me. And uh, I'm coming to terms and accepting that reality. It's not new for me. I know I've known it for a long time, but that's part of what I'm learning in the public, in the open. I have a lot of privilege, and I've spoken on this before. Being aware of one's privilege is important. I have a lot of privilege that I get to do that. I get to have all those arrows slung at me in public, and I'll come out on the other side bruised but okay. There's a lot of people without those privileges, and if I can be that voice for some other people, then I'm going to do that. Even though it's tough, I'm going to do that. So I'm being open and vulnerable in my social media about it. It sucks, right? I got a family to support and I'm trying to figure out how to pay bills, and it sucks. But I also know that at the end of the day, it's most important that I be authentic to who I am and what I've always been about for this industry. I'm going to keep being that. And we're going to find out if there's anybody out there that wants to pay a salary for that or not. But I'm not going to become a new thing. That's just not in me.
I appreciate it. I appreciate following your story and the fact you do that. And I have seen you take a bit of a beating on Twitter recently, and the way you responded to it was like really like class act. Like you said, hey, maybe there are some things that I should do different. I thought that's really cool. It showed a lot of humility and in general that no one's immune to this stuff. So it's interesting that you're going through a lot of the same things that others are going through. like
Mhm.
getting ghosted or quote unquote failing a test. And it's funny, I looked at that code pin, I thought, this is great. And I showed it to a bunch of people in a Slack group I'm in. I said, check this out. Like here's an example of how somebody that's, an expert at JavaScript would approach this challenge. And it was really cool to see that and that you posted it for the benefit of the rest of us to check out.
I I if there's some way, like there's a lot of things that I know that I've had impact on because people are kind to tell me what impact. But I know that there's been a lot of impact I've had that I don't know. All those people in the Slack that you just mentioned, maybe somebody got one little nugget out of something like that. Well, then it was worth it for me to post that, to go through the difficulty that I went through. If I can benefit somebody else in that way, then it was worth it for me to go through.
I'm curious about this. You seemed a little disillusioned with trends in web dev in general,
Mm.
and
Little.
and a little bit, and maybe with JavaScript as well. How would you handle a job at a React shop or a TypeScript shop or a Next.js shop? How do you kind of
Yeah.
balance your personal opinions with the needs of a business? And yeah, how would you approach that?
Well, I mean, that's very pressing as a topic right now because virtually every interview that I'm not getting a lot of conversations, but the ones I am getting, they're all React or Ember. They're all TypeScript. They're all in stacks that are not my preferred flavor. And I'll tell you in the audience the exact same thing I'm telling the job interviewers. I like to be real blunt about this stuff. You can count on me to always question why something is the way it is. And that's not just because it's something I don't like. Even stuff I like, I'm going to be questioning. So you can count on somebody brought me into one of those shops and I had to work in a TypeScript code base. Every day I'm going to be questioning, why is this helping us? Why are we doing it this way? Why is this frustration something that we feel is better than the alternative? I'm going to constantly do that. And some people don't want that. So if you don't want it, don't hire me. But I'm not someone who ever tries to come into a situation and say, move, I know better. That's never been my style. It's not my style. And I would never come in to a TypeScript and React shop and say, get rid of all this, delete it all, rewrite it. I'm going to have to learn to be productive in systems that are not my native preferred systems. And I'm going to question along the way. And I'm going to hope that maybe my questions help them at least own their decisions better. Because at the end of the day, if they never change a single thing about what they did, but they now know why that's their choice better than before I joined, then I had an impact on the org that I believe would be positive. So I would come in and I would be a much slower and less productive coder than anybody else they hired because I'd have to do a lot of learning and I'd also be doing a lot of questioning. But I'd hope along the way that I'd be generating conversations that were useful and generating artifacts in the form of better documentation, learning materials, etc. I would be doing in that job the same thing I did in the community, which is I'm going to lay down all of the stuff that I wish had been here before I got here. When I wrote the You Don't Know JS books, what I told people was I'm writing the books that I wish I could have read. And I would do the same thing in a job workplace. Even if it was in a style of code that is not my personal preference, I'm going to fit in with the team and do my best to contribute. And I'm going to make sure that that path is easier for the next person that came along.
Great. I was just curious because I thought, I wonder what, if you're like, hey, we're working a TypeScript shop. And I've heard some of your opinions on TypeScript as well.
Yeah,
But I think that makes sense. I think we all have opinions on whatever, but we work within the bounds of like the business context. But also it's important to question why. Why are we
right.
doing X, Y, or Z, not
See,
just this knee-jerk response?
I think there's a lot of cultures that would like to believe that they are resilient to that inquisition. They
Hmm.
would like to believe that, yeah, sure, we love people who question things and we love people that think out of the box. At the end of the day, what a lot of engineers are facing, and especially in the workplace, and this is true, the higher up you go, the more this is true. What you're facing is that a lot of people have had to make decisions in very suboptimal conditions without enough information, without enough time, without enough resources available to them. They've had to make these suboptimal decisions. And then they've said, almost in an exhausted and relieved sense, at least I don't ever have to make that decision again. And when someone like me comes along who can't help but ask why, that doesn't feel helpful to them. That feels challenging to them because it feels like it's drawing them back into their worst space. It's not my intent, but that's what it feels like to people. And I'm aware of that. And I can only say up front, that's how I am. I can't change that that's how I am.
You really summed it up well, because I'm thinking, like, personally, I've been in a few of those positions, and now I look back and I'm lucky enough to have a principal engineer on my team that does force me to question things like, why did we do this? What is the benefit that we did?
Right.
Was this something? And I look back and some of my decisions were out of either arrogance or out of, you know, ignorance or being
Uh-huh.
pressured into a certain way. And now I'm thinking, well, here now I've dug a hole that I
Right. Those
maybe not want to
questions
get out of.
feel like you feel like you're at risk. Like, oh God, am I
Exactly.
about to like be hung out to dry?
Yeah.
That's never, I don't think that's really ever the intention of someone like me or someone in those principal roles. That's never really the intention. But I think it can be taken that way by a lot of people. And so you have to be very careful about that.
Yeah, but they've been some of the best conversations I've had. Like, he and I have a really good relationship, and I really appreciate it because it's forced me to now look back and, one, not make those same mistakes in the future, but also understand that, hey, I have, bad decisions happen, and sometimes it's good to just question yourself too.
Sometimes it's good to just write down the bad decision, right?
Yeah, but
Like
document it.
just document why the
Yeah,
bad decision was made. And that may be a tough, bitter pill to swallow, but it would be far better to do that than to leave this void of nobody knows why we're doing it this way for the next 5 generations of people that come in. If you just I'm a big fan of this thing called an architectural decision record, and I
yeah,
like to evangelize this. An ADR. It's a document that you write that describes why you made a decision, what things went into the decision. And they're the two most important things about an ADR. Number one, that you write it, because most of the time these are just floating around in a few people's heads. So you have to write it down. You have to create an actual real artifact, something that is there. And the second most important thing is that an ADR is immutable. Once it's written, once everybody that has contributed to the knowledge of documenting the decision has put their input in, you put a stamp on it and you say, this never changes. We can always do a new ADR that makes a different decision, but we can never go back and change the past. The past is what it is, and we just documented the reality. We had to make this shitty decision because the client gave us no time to make the decision. Write that down, make it immutable, and leave that breadcrumb for other people to build upon.
I like the immutable part. We haven't done that part. That's a really
The
good
immutable part is
part.
really important.
Yeah.
Make a new ADR and point to the old one and say, we're reversing our plan, but don't just go back and edit that ADR. It's
Yeah, because then you might say, "Oh, let's add more. Let's add more context here. What,
no,
somebody's in the business is mad now. Let's change it to, satisfy." Oh, I could totally see how we could, game the system a bit on there.
yeah,
It's a
you
really
got to
good
make
one.
them immutable.
Yeah, smart. Any last words for our audience?
I would say that we've touched on a few different things. One of the questions that comes up a lot is people ask me a lot, how do I get into this? How do I do this? And what they're really asking, sometimes they say it and many times they don't, is how do I be like you? And I want to say out there, there's there's no other person that's going to be a Brian, and there's no other person that's going to be a Kyle, right? My path to how I've gotten here, I hope, is insightful, is illustrative, is useful in some way to people, but I hope that it's not useful in the sense of being some kind of blueprint that people ought to aspire to. What you really should be looking for are the sometimes intangible character traits that underlie a lot of these journeys. When you listen to a podcast like this, what I hope people are looking for is, what is that person's character that helped them to make these decisions? And if someone can pick up on some of the principles and the character traits that I have and use those to make their own journey, I think they're going to be a better person and have a better result. And I hope that there's a lot of people out there that get to where, approximately where I am someday. I hope they get there with a lot easier journey than what it took me. And that's what I hope people will take from this discussion. Don't just go try to do some gamified version of me and get there quicker, but do listen to the things that are the underlying principles, the values, the character traits of people you listen to. If you admire the outcome, don't try to replicate the outcome, try to replicate the character. And I hope that I've laid enough of that out there for people to pick up on.
Really appreciate that. Thank you so much, Kyle. Thanks for being with us and sharing your story and just in general, everything you've done for the JS community. That'll do it for today's episode of the Develop Yourself podcast. To learn more about becoming a software engineer with us, then check out parsity.io. If you're not quite ready for that, then jump into our dev30.xyz program, which is 30 days of working on your mindset, habits, and JavaScript skills. Totally worth it. See you next week.